So now I would like to introduce our panelists, and we have Catherine Anastasi from Talk Sport. We have Lisa Bradley from the University of Sheffield, Rachel Wood from Reuters, Richard Duggan from NewsQuest, and Vicky Gale from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. So I'd like to hand over to each of my panelists to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about themselves, their backgrounds, and experiences. And I'd really like, as a first question, really, I'd like to ask everybody why you think it's important for us to be discussing journalist safety and resilience on World Mental Health Day. So Catherine, would you mind if I start with you?
Of course. Yeah, thank you for hosting this panel. I think it's really important because as journalists in whatever field of journalism you're in, you do come up against either weighty issues, important issues that you're dealing with that people can be polarised on, or physical safety issues. And all of that will have an effect on your mental health. So building resilience, etc., is really important, and having an open conversation about some of those things will help anybody who's feeling a little bit on their own. So yeah, my background, I started off, I actually went to University of Sheffield, so yay. And I did politics, but I also did student radio there. I went a couple of modules in journalism in my first year as an elective. I just love the radio so much that I decided that I wanted to go into that. So I went on into the Masters at Goldsmiths in radio. And after that, I sent my CV to every radio station in the country, I think from Aberdeen to Guernsey, and TalkSport ran me back. So I've been there for 16 years this August. Started off as a broadcast assistant and worked my way up. Did live production for a long time, moved into outside broadcasts just 2016-ish. And then I became head of live sport. So I was in charge of anything that happened outside of the studio, which involved a lot of safety and risk assessments, because we were traveling to some interesting places. For example, I spent 5 months in Russia, and not just in Moscow and St. Petersburg, some fairly interesting places in Russia as well. So I did that for about 3.5 years, and then this January I was promoted to deputy, which is a whole new kettle of fish, a lot less journalism, a lot more HR, a lot more budgeting. But obviously supporting my colleagues who are doing what I did before and trying to help in any way that I can. So that's a little bit about me. You're on mute, Laura.
Apologies. Rachel.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me here. For over a decade, I've worked in digital and social video production, firstly as an entertainment journalist at Sky and BBC, and then in news journalism for the Press Association, Mirror Online, Sky News, and now at Reuters. So the entertainment side involved field producing on TV sets and red carpets, and the news side involved news gathering in the online space, so handling user-generated content, UGC, live news and features. And now at Reuters, I'm also the global coordinator for our peer support network, which I'm sure I'll mention a couple of times through this chat because it's a wonderful scheme to have in any newsroom. We're a group of trained journalists for mental support across the newsroom. And we work on one-to-one support. We push people towards our professional therapy services if that's what they feel they need. We host group support sessions. We do initiatives on mental health across Reuters. So I have that wonderful position for the next year. And why I feel it's important, I'm sure reflecting what everybody here thinks, is that talking about these things and having an open forum, I think, is the best way to bust stigma, to normalize conversations. And I'm sure all of our panelists here are going to be talking about how as little as 5 years ago, but certainly 10 years ago, and certainly any time before that, talking about these things just wasn't a thing in the newsroom. It was very much seen that, yes, the job is tough, but if you can't handle it, you shouldn't be here. And the fact of the matter is we're all human beings. And not only is the work stressful for a number of different reasons, it can be, but we also have stuff in our personal lives, and to expect us to come through the office door and act like a robot and be impervious to stress is not doable, and it causes harm. So talking about it will normalize the humanness of us and our industry.
Thank you, Rachel. Richard, over to you.
Hello, everyone. So my background is actually in law. I had a law degree for my sins, and then I went on to a master's in law before I saw the error of my ways, having done some student journalism, and I thought, right, I'm going to ditch that. And then after a little break, trying to figure out how to break into the industry, I did my NCTJ at the PA in Newcastle when it still existed. And then I got my first job in local news at Essex Live and the Essex Chronicle in, I think it was the end of 2016. And while I was there, the first 16 months, my kind of specialty very quickly became court. So I spent a lot of time in Crown Court, and that meant I was exposed to quite a lot of very unpleasant cases. There were quite a lot of serious cases over the time when I was in Essex. So that's partly why I wanted to get involved today, because obviously we do cover lots of very grim areas, and I think it's really important to be able to talk about that and the effect it has on you. You're not weak because you find a particular case disturbing. And then after that, I was promoted to news desk, and I spent the rest of my time sort of in senior positions. And again, what I found from that is in my new role, which I started in January, I'm responsible for about 55 people over 12 titles. Now, that's a lot of people with lots of their own, as another of the people on the calls mentioned, you know, everyone has their own personal lives, but they're all dealing with certain stories, certain cases, and, you know, they'll have stuff that they need to bring to you. And as senior managers, I think it's really important that we are open to talking about mental health and learning around it and how we can actually make sure we protect our staff, because I would argue that mental health is just as important as physical health, and you wouldn't ignore a physical ailment, so you shouldn't ignore a mental ailment either. So that's why I really wanted to get involved.
Thank you, Richard. Lisa.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So my background is I did the Masters here at the University of Sheffield 25 years ago, and I am now Deputy Head of the school. I'm Head of Undergraduate Journalism, and I'm also Head of Pastoral Care. My background is similar to Richard's in terms of I've covered a lot of horrible things while I was a reporter. So my background is crime reporting regionally and nationally. And what I found, and the reason I think that I'm probably here today, is that about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a huge mega spike with mental health issues with my students, everyone's students like across the whole country. And that filtered into trainee reporters going into newsrooms as well. And I was getting feedback from a lot of editors that were saying the students are just not prepared for newsroom life. Now, my big thing and my research that I have done is about absolutely making sure we're talking about mental health, but for me, it's building in how to train students in resilience so they can cope with it. So it's about being able to give them a toolkit to go on and have a really successful career and understand that, yeah, it can be a really awful job sometimes, but it's not about running away from that and shying away from it. It's about having the tools to cope with it. So I have spent the last 4 to 5 years researching and writing a book on this that's coming out in February, but also building it into the curriculum with our students. And I think that's probably why I'm here today and why I've got such an invested interest in it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lisa. And finally, Vicky.
Hi, everyone. I just realised actually that I do know Richard. So I used to read his work. I used to work at one of the competing titles that Essex Live was our competitor. So I do know Richard's stuff. I transitioned from local and regional news in Colchester, which is in North Essex, to then going into more data journalism. And that eventually led to a role with TBIJ, which is the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. I'm in the Bureau local team at the moment. So I was looking at health inequalities initially, and now I do more general inequalities and kind of community-led reporting. The issue of mental health is so important for me, because I used to find that when I worked in regional news, I was quite surprised that no one really spoke about mental health or mental well-being, considering how involved the job is and how public facing it is. And I think kind of looking at the situation now, we're living in a very hostile society, particularly if you're a minority group like myself, if you're a Black female, or, you know, you have any other kind of identities that put you more at risk of harm. So I just think it's incredibly important to keep talking about and being aware of in a nutshell.
Thank you, Vicky. And I think, you know, just wait for everyone to go. And it's interesting that, you know, I think all of you have mentioned the fact that now it's on the agenda, people are talking more about mental health and well-being. It's more spoken about in the newsroom. And I just wonder, you know, with mental health and also with safety and resilience, you know, if we track back 20 years, which is, you know, when I started my career in journalism, it wasn't something that was discussed. And I just wonder how you've sort of seen that evolve kind of in the last probably decade or so, and particularly in the last few years. I think online, you know, and social media has clearly got a part to play. But I'd be really interested to hear what your views are on that. Lisa, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, of course. So I'm going to be super careful not to mention any names of news organisations, because a lot of what I've been doing is speaking to really recent graduates that have gone into industry and their experience of it. And absolutely, I mean, the majority of lots of us here, we didn't talk about the mental health issues back in the day. We didn't talk about how it affected us. We've all thought probably that it made us a lesser journalist if we admitted that we were having sleepless nights, that we were having, after a while, post-traumatic stress syndrome, because of the sort of level and the constant vicarious trauma that we were suffering. And I think that now, from what I can see from my students and from the very recent graduates, is that they are so willing and probably so much more emotionally intelligent, maybe, is that the right word, that they are able to say, actually, this isn't right, this isn't okay. So I'll give you an anonymized example of one of my very recent graduates that on the third day the job was asked to edit a video of a soldier being shot in the Ukraine, and she was told that to watch it again and again and again and work out what wasn't okay for the wider audience to see. Now, she was
several comments.
Nobody at any point thought to double check that she was okay. So it was okay for her to see all that, but there was no sort of scaffolding put in place. She had no one to talk to about it. And then these videos kept coming to her day after day after day, until eventually, you know, she went off sick for a month because she was having intrusive thoughts and nightmares, and she felt there was absolutely zero support in place. However, an alternate student went to a different news organisation and was immediately put on a sort of resilience training scheme, was given all the right scaffolding, and is now doing really, really well. So I think people are absolutely more willing to talk about it, but it's about the actions, I think, moving forward. About, we can all talk about how difficult we're finding something, we can talk about the triggers, we can talk about how, you know, listening to really horrendous, explicit sexual violence details in court is really horrendous for people. And the Lucy Letby trial is a really good example of that. You know, it really affected the people that were, I know that's not sexual violence, but it really, the victim impact statements, which are a relatively new thing, really, 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 really affected the reporters there. But it's about having the coping strategies, I think. It needs to be more than just talking about mental health. It needs to be, what do we do to protect ourselves? And what do we do as newsroom managers or as senior journalists or as training bodies in order to make sure that protection, it's not protection even, I don't even think I'm using the right word there, because we can't protect the journalists from this. This is the news, unfortunately. These things happen. This is the world that we live in. So they will face these things. So what can we do in order to make sure that they are accessing support, but perhaps maybe better prepared for the job they're about to go into? I don't know if that's a little bit controversial to say, though.
Absolutely, and I think that's something we'll pick up on later in the discussion, Lisa. Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, I think Lisa's right. I don't think you can get away from the fact that, unfortunately, part of the news is there's lots of horrible stuff that we have to report on, and you can't get away from that. I think that is the sad reality of the job. But what you can do is to be able to speak about it to your mentors, to your colleagues, to your bosses, to say, actually, I found this case really difficult, to be able to utilize the various HR mechanisms that you have in place. So if you've got an EAP at work, if, you know, for example, I'll give an anonymized version as well. Several years ago, when I used to work at Reach, there was a girl I worked with who she'd gone through a terrible family bereavement, and she very understandably said to her line manager at the time, I'd really like not to go to inquest for a little bit. That's not an unreasonable request to say, actually, I've had something really terrible happen in my personal life. Can my company, the company I work for, please help me out? That request was complied with, and it was totally acceptable. What I think has gotten worse over the years, which has probably affected me most, is the sheer amount of abuse that journalists get on social media, and how bold members of the public are now about abusing people. So when I was a trainee reporter, I covered a totally run-of-the-mill, and that sounds awful, but totally run-of-the-mill sex offender case, however, it had to be postponed due to some paperwork issue. Anyway, I didn't think anything of it. And about 3 weeks later, an anonymous account on Facebook messaged me with a load of information, such as my date of birth, my address, where my parents used to live, where my parents' businesses were. And it was absolutely incredibly unnerving. My boss was fantastic. He immediately said, yeah, let's go to the police. We reported it to the police, and they were able to find the culprit. They asked me if I'd like them to be prosecuted for malicious communications. I said yes. They weren't prosecuted. They were given a warning, and then they were told they'd have to write a letter of apology to me. To this date, 6 years later, I've never had that letter of apology, because to my mind, the police didn't take it that seriously. I'd like to think that if that happened now, after obviously we've seen some very horrific attacks against journalists, even a murder against journalists in Northern Ireland a few years ago, that would happen. But unfortunately, the public have become much bolder when it comes to using social media to attack journalists, and that's something you do have to be prepared for. You can't get away from using social media. You have to use it in the job. It's almost impossible to be a journalist and not use social media, but you have to take steps to try and protect yourself.
Absolutely. And as I say, we'll come on to some more practical advice that each of you have got for people in terms of that protection. Rachel, can I come to you? Because I know you've been kind of, as part of your role with the peer network. Do you want to explain a little bit more about the peer network, and also, sort of how you feel that the conversation's evolved over the last few years?
Absolutely. So Reuters, as a global news organization, around 8 to 10 years ago, realized, well, it was the senior editors who started to talk about how we as an organization had a moral obligation to protect people's mental well-being and safety alongside their physical safety equally too. So, well, approximately 13 years ago, the company very brilliantly decided to fund free private psychotherapy for anyone who's ever worked for Reuters. So even if you're a stringer, a freelancer who's done one day of work for Reuters, and that day was the horrific court case that they're now dreaming about 20 years later, you can still come back and use that free professional therapy service. But they found no one was using it, because the leap from I have the occasional panic attack, is this normal, to I should speak to a professional is quite a big leap for most people. And they realized that what journalists have been doing for decades is going down to the pub and downing 10 pints and swapping war stories and sort of soothing and connecting that way. So in order to replicate that in a healthier way, we created the peer network. So these professional therapists train staff members to a certain level of peer support. So we can be just the person you sit next to, or the person that sits over there, or someone on your team, or someone with a similar background, someone who's worked on similar stories, someone who's worked in similar places across the world. And you can go to them and just have that little, hey, is this normal? Or, wow, that story I just worked on was really quite intense. Conversation opener. So that's the primary thing, is to be that first person that someone can reach out to and say, hi, how are you? Yeah, I'm not great, which tends to be how the conversations happen. And yeah, we do a lot of outreach. So this week, for example, I'm reaching out to my colleagues that work in Gaza. I'm reaching out to any of my Arabic speaking colleagues who can help support our journalists that are going into the field, who are worried about family members, you know, the personal life that comes alongside working in journalism. It all compounds together. A lot of one-to-one stuff, group sessions. So we may do, for example, in a week or two, a group counselling therapy session with our teams in Gaza and on the ground. So that's how our peer support network operates. And we're really, really proud of that at Reuters. And we've helped numerous other organisations set up their own sort of versions. But in terms of how that industry has changed, you know, that peer support network has been in place for 8 years. And each year it's evolved and gotten more complex and much better. So one of the biggest things that Reuters is really looking at now is a properly diverse and intersectional approach to mental well-being and support, because, you know, us here in this call are very lucky to be in the UK, where, you know, the heads of our royal family are talking about their own mental health. That is just simply not the case for many, many, many communities who aren't white and middle class, and many, many, many places in the world. And we've got to think about different ways that we can help people build the toolkit, as we're talking about, and the resilience and talking about mental health in a way that speaks to people where they're at, with their own backgrounds, with their own cultures. And we can only be looking at that now because we've already got the basic structure in place, which is it's good to talk. You've got to start at that square one before you build from it. And these kinds of things simply, I don't know, to my knowledge, didn't exist 10 years ago. So.
Thank you, Rachel. And Vicky, in your role as an investigations journalist, you obviously have to kind of prepare yourself for some of the situations you might face. I mean, we will move on to some more some questions around practical guidance soon. But what would you know? What are the things that you put in place when you know that you're going out and you're reporting on a particular story?
Yeah, I think it's about having very frank and honest conversations, a bit similar to what Rachel was saying. You can't kind of separate yourself from what's going on in the world, what's going on in your personal life. So I think one of the good things about working at the Bureau is that they've kind of eliminated the shame around speaking about what's going on, so everyone can have those honest conversations. But then also in terms of the very practical side of things, you would have a conversation about what you think the risk could be with a particular story, with a particular project, and kind of try and mitigate against those as best as possible, and keep going back to that conversation throughout the project as well. So as new risks are coming up and as you're learning about new things that you need to, you know, potentially prevent yourselves from experiencing, you would kind of have those conversations. So it's an ongoing chat, basically, for us.
Thanks, Vicky. And Catherine, obviously you're in the world of sport, which can be particularly susceptible to criticism, shall we say? And I just wonder, you know, again, what are your experiences been during your time at TalkSport?
It's changed a lot, and I think it's maybe probably slightly different to some of the guys who've been reporters on the ground. Obviously, we're radio, so we're not necessarily investigating loads. It's not really something that we do that often, although we have done. But for us, it's that blurring of lines over the last 10 years, and particularly in the last 5 years, as you said, between the private and the professional, especially online. A lot of our presenters, but even our producers, have a personal brand, an online presence, and all of the kind of nastiness that you sometimes get in stadiums, it is also happening on particularly Twitter, but a lot of places online. So if something big happens in the world, even the recent example with Israel and Gaza over the last few days, we'll get people, broadcast assistants, answering phone calls to listeners and being abused, and it's nothing to do with what's going out on air. It's just that they've rung a number and want to shout at someone because it's anonymous, and that's really difficult to deal with, especially when you're young and you're coming in. It just might be your first job. So we have a zero tolerance policy on stuff like that. totally encourage our sort of staff, trainees and broadcast assistants to just hang up, and they're told that immediately when they come in. But that can go even further. You know, Laura Woods was one of our presenters. She's left now, but she used to get horrible abuse and people sending her stuff in the post, and that's really tricky to deal with. I mean, at News, who's our umbrella organisation, you know, we have a security team who took that on board and helped her and managed to get it to stop with the help of the police. So it's definitely got more intense. I mean, from a personal perspective, I don't tweet opinions about sport. I tweet promotional stuff about what we're doing, but I very rarely put my head above the parapet. That's a conscious thing for me. I never wanted to be a presenter. I never wanted to be famous. I've always gone down the production route, so there's partly that. But also, I've had, you know, when I have done it, I've had people telling me what they're going to do to me, and that's, you know, I don't want to invite that into my life. Thank you very much. And that's got worse. And so there's definitely things that we need to change. I think, you know, hopefully where I am, the culture has changed at work, so there is now more open conversation between colleagues. So, you know, there is very little shame. I would think that most people would be comfortable at least reaching out to their closest peer at work and having a conversation about they're going through something, and we can adapt and help through that. But the risk of this long term, I think, of people getting this abuse online is of self-censoring. Like I self-censor, right? I don't put an opinion out, and that's detrimental to the press as a whole. So it's a really, really big issue, and I'm not quite sure what the answer is. But having a culture of openness in the workplace is a good first step.
Absolutely. Thanks, Catherine. And just, you know, I think it would be really good now to move on to actually what advice can we offer everybody on this session today. And also I'm thinking with the creating that culture of openness, it's great that organisations are doing that, but it's also how do individuals kind of feel empowered to actually, you know, step up and actually, you know, talk to their employers about what's going on, because quite sometimes people might feel embarrassed or they just don't want to kind of talk about it. You know, sometimes, Richard, you might have experience of this, but some reporters these days are actually working, you know, at home quite a lot of the time. And so I just wonder what can you say to individual journalists to say, no, do speak up, you know, do make your voice heard. And Rachel, could we start with you on that?
I mean, picking up actually off something Lisa said earlier about preparedness and what's in your toolbox, and learning resilience is one of the big things that we work on at Reuters. We our hostile environment training courses, every single one of our journalists at Reuters goes on, even the desk-based, you know, the UGC editors who are quite exposed to vicarious trauma. And it's only in the last 2 to 3 years that they have made it 1/3 mental health, 1/3 online safety, and 1/3 physical. That's a total flip from 100% physical safety. So we talk a lot about resilience as a muscle, as a tool that you need to work on, you need to work at it, you need to build it. So one of the pieces of advice I would give is to know yourselves really well, because the harder stories to cover, or the ones that impact us the most, tend to have a bit of a personal string to it, and it might not be something you've even been aware of before. It might not be as obvious as you've had your own horrific car crash and now you're covering a horrific car crash. It might not be as obvious as that, but if you know yourself, if you start to recognize your triggers, what kind of stuff are you covering that just gives you that little extra bit of discomfort, or you're taking it home with you at night. Think about what you've done before when you've been through a stressful or difficult time. Who did you speak to? What helped? What tools did you have? Think about it like the risk assessment one of you talked about as well, Vicky. You're not just preparing for where you're going to go, who you're going to speak to. You're also preparing for what might happen online. You know, as Catherine says, if I cover this story and then I tweet about it, what is the potential impact? And what am I going to do about it when that happens? It's about that. On the hostile environment courses, they teach you to what to pack in your grab bag for emergencies. Usually for the hostile environments, we don't tend to have that issue here. I don't have a grab bag, but I have a mental grab bag. What is in my bag? Who do I need to speak to? What do I need? Usually eat well, sleep, move and exercise, the basic 3 things you need to be mentally well. But what else is in your toolkit? And you can figure that out. And that's within your responsibility. Any organization you work for also has a big responsibility for your mental safety, but you also do as well. So that would be my big advice.
Thanks, Rachel. And Richard.
I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle. I think if you're a line manager with a responsibility for managing people, it's very much on you to foster an environment of, I personally have an open door policy. I'd like to think my team, many of whom are on this call, so I'm sure they'll tell me later on if they don't think this is the case, that they know that I'm very open about mental health. I talk about it quite a lot. I've always tried to foster an open door policy where people know they can come and talk to me about mental health, and that they won't be kind of receiving an eye roll or kind of just get on with it mentality. So I think if you are in charge of people, you have a responsibility to not just signpost them to the many brilliant things an organization might have, but that you are willing to listen to them. And I'd say secondly, if you are the person who wants to talk about your mental health issue or something that's affected you, if you don't feel your line manager is the right person, there will always be someone else in an organization at a slightly more senior level to you who will be willing to listen. You don't have to report these things to your line manager. If you just don't have that relationship with them, that's okay, that's fine. There might be certain subjects that you would feel more comfortable speaking to someone about, your own gender, perhaps your own sexuality, the own colour of your skin, anything like that. You can help set what you need in terms of getting the help that you want. So don't feel you have to just use that direct report. Look around the newsroom, look around the organisation. Is there someone else who you trust slightly more, who you might feel would be better at fighting your corner or helping liaise with your line manager, for example?
Thank you, Richard. Catherine.
Again, it's kind of following on from what Richard was saying then there. It's about leading from a place of vulnerability. So I think if you are open with the people around you about your own mental health and your own experiences, they will feel more able to come to you with theirs. And also creating, this is probably more in your toolkit, your grab bag, but boundaries, I think, has been the biggest thing for me. I mean, I've had my own mental health stuff brought on by external things, not work, but exacerbated by work. And I think having that time away from your phone, figuring out when that might be best, not constantly checking emails outside of work hours, and just finding what you're comfortable with and what works for you. So creating strong boundaries around your work, especially if it's involved in online, is really important. The one thing I would say around sport, not really touched on, is if you're away for a long time, and I think this is something that's with sports people as well, who go away for a long time for some number of months to cover a tournament. That can be really, not just from a physical safety thing, but just missing home, being away from your support, being away from your everyday. That can be really tough. And I found when I was away for a long time, what helped me was carving out, because if you're awake, you're working pretty much when you're on tour. So I found just carving out a couple of hours to go and do something where you are that you want to do without anybody else, without a colleague. Just take some time for you. So that might be going to an art gallery, or it might be just sitting and having a coffee and a cake somewhere or whatever, but just taking yourself away from that work situation as much as you can, if you're away for some number of weeks, can really help me with my mental health, because it does take a real big toll when you're away. And I've never been to a war zone or anything like that, so I can't really advise on that situation. It might be a bit tougher. But if you are traveling for work, carving out time for yourself is really important and would help, in my opinion.
Thanks, Catherine. And Vicky, over to you. And also, I wondered if you could also touch on what advice you might have for freelance journalists as well, who might not have employers that can support them.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you're struggling to be more open about your own kind of struggles with mental health, another way to go about it would be to suggest some training. So, for example, I've had DART Centre trainings, that's the DART Centre for Journalism and Trauma. So that kind of opened up a conversation amongst my colleagues. So if you see similar trainings like that you think would benefit you, you can suggest that to your line manager for the entire organisation to have, or your particular team. So that could be a way to kind of depersonalize it. And I think with regards to social media as well, it's so important, like Catherine was saying, just have boundaries. So I know that we feel that we have to be kind of on top of everything and always checking everything, but it's not good for your well-being. I've found that out, and I've had to kind of, reduce the time spent on it. But, you could just make it very useful. So when you have to go on social media, for example, do you have lists that you can just check specific accounts that's going to get you the information that you need for the day and then come off it? Can you give yourself time limits? So you're only on there for 20 minutes, half an hour, and then you come off. So kind of trying to be a bit stricter and more efficient with the time spent on social media. And with regards to freelance journalists, I think it's super important to have some kind of union representation. So be part of a union and also have some networks as well, so that when you are going through something or you just need some advice, there's a group of people that you can talk to, because I think that's super important. And like I said, they lack that kind of newsroom camaraderie as well.
Thanks, Vicky. And we've actually had a question from Anne Galpin, who's asked, how do panellists see the role of member organisations and trade unions, such as the NUJ, in supporting members around mental health and distress, which you've kind of just touched upon there. Rachel, do you sort of feel that, member organisations can support as well, especially freelancers?
I was actually thinking when I read Anne's brilliant question, I don't know. I only have one experience of reaching out to the NUJ. It was many, many years ago. And it probably isn't relevant because there weren't the structures in place. So I don't know if anyone else has experience of using other member organisations or unions for mental health.
Catherine?
I don't have any experience either in reaching out to the NUJ or trade unions. To be honest, I think that's probably because I've had a good support structure apart from my employer. So I've never been in that position. But so I can't really speak for experience on that one. I'm really sorry.
Thank you. Lisa, I want to move on to you now, because obviously you're kind of representing the education sector today. I'm pretty sure we've got quite a number of student journalists on the session today. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the education centres are doing in this area, and also, any sort of advice that you could pass on?
Of course. So, you know what, it's a bit of a difficult balancing act when we're talking about sort of resilience training and mental health issues in the newsroom to student journalists. Because, guys, we don't want to put you off. This is an incredible career, and hopefully there's loads of student journalists here. It's a wonderful job. Being a journalist is a privilege, it's an honour. But because all you probably hear is it's traumatic, it's awful, you have to listen to this, you have to do that, you're going to get abused online. I think it's really important to remember why you're doing this in the first place. And I think that's what educators need to remember when they're thinking about how to build resilience into their curriculum, is it's all about the bigger picture. If you don't have the toolkit, then these people's voices don't get heard. Power isn't held to account. Justice isn't seen to be done. And so these are amazing, wonderful things that you're being trained to do. And the resilience training is scaffolding you to be able to do that. And I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of why we're doing this, of what a brilliant career that it is. And I think that's probably the biggest barrier I had when rolling out the trauma and resilience training at the University of Sheffield, with everyone saying, and the powers that be above me, outside of the journalism programme, saying, well, don't put students off coming, otherwise the last thing that you want to do is not have people come through the doors. So it's actually trying really hard to give it a blended approach, to not frighten students, but just to be more honest. So that means that hopefully when you are going onto real life journalism and you're making that transition from being a student to being an active reporter, it's not as overwhelming because you're prepared for it. And I think that what I have learned through, I've done lots of experiential sort of work in terms of the teaching structures, what our students have responded the best to is simulated environments where it's safe we put them in comfortable situations, and it's a safe place for them to then express their feelings without feeling judged, without feeling like they've got a deadline to hit, without feeling they're not good enough. So we've done a lot of work around that. One of the things that we did last year was we put on a mock.
Other Israeli civilians on its kibbutz being abducted by Palestinians.
Oh, what's that? Sorry, what we did was we put on a really explicit rape case, and we hired really good professional actors to do it, because you have to have that. It can't be cringe like your tutors reading it out. And we put them in that experience. They listened to the explicit details, because that was the main shock, was not understanding the level of detail that comes out in court. And then we had psychologists and wellbeing advisors after that experience do small group teaching to process the feelings that some people had, especially those that themselves were victims of sexual offences in the past, that they had felt triggered. And they put together little peer support groups, which was great. And we do various different simulated environments like this as well. So it's about creating a safe space, preparing you, putting together the grab bag. I'm going to nick that. I hope no one minds, because I really like it. It's what, rather than toolkit, which is a rubbish word, the grab bag, and every individual student understanding what's in their own grab bag, because everyone's different. So in terms of education centres, I'm delighted that the NCTJ have thrown themselves really behind the need for this. And it is now an accreditation requirement that centres teach in resilience and safety training. I think it's still a journey, and being able to get the balance right about frightening people and preparing them is probably the trickiest bit. Hopefully everyone will get there. And I think I am actually running a how to teach your students trauma resilience in November. So if anyone would like to sign up for that, you'd be very more than welcome.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lisa. Now, we're coming to the end of our session, but I can see we've got a couple of questions. And Katie French, that is the question that I was going to ask at the end, so we'll save that one till after, if you don't mind. But in the meantime, Amen has asked a question about TV journalists, Catherine, if you could pick that one up. And she's asking whether TV journalists get bullied, or I guess face more difficulties because they are the face of newsrooms, and I guess they're more in the public eye and so on.
Yes, I think probably. I think any journalist who's facing outwards, so that could be a TV journalist or a radio journalist or a print journalist, if they're like distributing widely online as well. But I think it's also, there's probably an element of the diversity and intersectionality thing here, because I would say our female and non-white journalists get a lot more than our white male journalists, from my experience. And it's usually much more personal than some of our white male journalists might get abuse because they've got a differing opinion on Arsenal, for example, and they'll say that you're an idiot for having that opinion. But from the experiences of our people with different backgrounds, is that it's more like you're an idiot because of who you are. And that's more tricky to deal with. That I would say affects those people a lot more. So that's definitely something that we've been aware of a lot more over the last few years. But I think much more than if you're behind the scenes, you're definitely going to get more attention, and the more attention you get, the more trolling, essentially, unfortunately. But you can react to that, and I would say if you do get, as a journalist starting out, if you do get someone saying something to you that is on Twitter or whatever platform that isn't very nice, most of the time the best thing to do is to not react to it. not put fuel on the fire, because in my experience, if a presenter has gone back and you end up having a to and fro, it just escalates, and more people pile on, and then you get that pile on, and that is when you can get some really, really impactful trauma. So yeah, my suggestion most of the time is to ignore people, which is hard to do, but it's sometimes, most of the time, the best way forward.
Absolutely. Thanks, Catherine. So I'd like to finish on a question from Katie French, who has said, completely agree with Lisa Bradley's comments. Being a journalist is a brilliant job and it is a privilege. What is the one takeaway that you would all put forward, particularly around building personal resilience? Vicky, could we start with you on that one?
Yeah, I've been racking my brain on this since I read the question, because it's quite a hard one. But I think ultimately you have to believe in yourself and really know that you know your craft. Like something I've said since I was in local news, you know, if someone challenges you on a decision that you've made, for example, or how you framed a story, if you know that you're confident in what you've written and you're confident in the knowledge that you have, you're kind of able to professionally attack that situation with a bit more confidence. So I think just believe in yourself, but also like hone your craft and your skills, most importantly. So then you're undeniable.
Thanks, Vicky. Rachel.
Yeah, brilliant answer. I mean, resilience we talk about as our ability to bounce back. And I think what all of us have talked about here today is the fact that we're not impervious. So knowing that we're not impervious to things affecting us, but what are the things that you can put in place in order to allow yourself to be able to bounce back? We've also talked a lot about how the nature of the job has changed a lot. You're online all the time. You're taking work home. A lot of us are working from home. It works on your phone all the time. It's buzzing while you're in the shower. Putting in place those boundaries and giving yourself the time to properly rest and heal and rejuvenate, because burnout, the epidemic of burnout that's happening across journalism, only happens when you're in a sustained period of cumulative stress over a long period of time. So what you need to do is make sure there are breaks in that stress, and you've got to shoehorn those in. One of our therapists calls it the crowbar tactic. Many days, I say some days, many days, you find yourself not being able to have a lunch break, having not had a drink for the last few hours, having not eaten properly. Where can you crowbar those breaks in? Because that'll be what breaks the cumulative stress, and that'll be where your resilience comes from.
Thank you, Rachel. Catherine.
I mean, all of the things that have already been said, but one that's a little bit personal to me. So I was really stressed in 2021 because all the sport was cancelled, and then it all came back at the same time, and that was awful, and very stressful. And on top of that, lots of different COVID regulations for various different countries that you had to navigate, and etc. But at the same time, I got really ill, and I got cancer. So I found out I had cancer. And one of the silver linings of coming through that cancer journey and coming out the other side is that it doesn't matter. It gave me an amazing perspective, right? On this day, the thing that is stressful about my job, which is which producer I'm going to put on which show or whatever, I'll make a decision and then it'll happen, and it'll either be good or it won't be good or whatever. But at the end of the day, it just isn't going to be that important what happens today in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. What's important is my health, is that I'm enjoying my life, is that I'm with my family and my friends and my support system, and that I'm it's the know yourself element that was talked about earlier. I've got to know myself through that illness journey. So for me, it's perspective. It's putting your head up and saying, like, what I'm doing now, where is it in the context of my life? And just trying to give yourself those moments through boundaries, through space, for thinking, to just put your head up and go like, okay, is this as important as my anxiety or my anxious feelings is making me think it is? So trying to maintain some perspective is probably my top tip.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for sharing that with us. It's quite powerful. Lisa.
I want to say thank you to Catherine as well for sharing something so personal. So you've inspired me to as well. So my youngest son is quite severely autistic, and we do a lot of work with him in building his personal resilience. So here's what we do. Here's my very quick drawing that I just did, which is of 2 trees. We've got the strong oak tree, and we've got, I don't know what's a tree that isn't strong, a birch tree. I'm not big on trees. And the idea is that, and I always ask my students this, and this is what they said as their takeaway lesson about building personal resilience, is that you would think the oak tree is the symbol of resilience with its sturdy trunk and its strong roots, but actually it's the birch tree that weathers the storm and still bounces back that is actually the stronger one. And it's a culmination of what you two have just said. It's about the bounce back, but it's also about understanding that this too will pass. So no matter how horrendous you feel in the moment, you're not going to feel like that in 48 hours, a week, a month. And every time you experience something like this, that resilience muscle just gets stronger and stronger and stronger till eventually you do become a lot sturdier. And so it's, don't be stressed about being stressed, because stress is a natural reaction. Don't be anxious about being anxious, because it's normal and it's human. And at the end of it, it's probably going to be a first world problem. So just get some perspective and gratitude as well.
Thank you, Lisa. And finally, Richard.
It's a lesson I wish I could learn myself, and I am trying to. Don't feed the trolls. It's so tempting, but it's what they want. They want you to come on Twitter. They want you to bite back at them. Don't get me wrong, we have to accept we have to be criticised sometimes. I've made mistakes. I'm sure everyone on this call has made a mistake at some point. That's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with the public giving us feedback. They don't have to be so bloody rude to us sometimes, quite frankly. But there are other times when actually you can just tell by the profile of the way they're talking to you, they're not worth it. Don't talk to them. You might be really tempted to, but I don't think it will make you feel any better. Just walk away. It's much better for your mental health to do that.
Thanks, Richard. A really great way to end our discussion today. So I'd like to thank our brilliant panelists who are actually been really inspiring, and I think we can all walk away with this session and with some really thought-provoking tips for how we manage our careers. So thank you everybody for attending. We have recorded this session, and we will be sharing the video with everybody that's registered, and we'll also be putting on our website and our social media channels. We would really appreciate it if you could take the time to give us your feedback. So after this session, we will be circulating some forms, which will just take a minute or so to complete. For more information on any of our training sessions, which include short sessions on safety and resilience and mental health and wellbeing in the newsroom, you'll find these in the website, and then it was actually posted in the chat as well. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to remind you that the NCTJ's Awards for Excellence entry deadline is approaching, but there is still time for you to put your entries in. So please visit our website for more details. Thanks again, everybody, for attending. Thank you to the panelists, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Cheers, Laura. I'll see you later.
Thank you, Catherine. I'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.